let me remind you that a two-state solution was first offered to Palestinian leaders, and back then they would have been known as Arab and Muslim leaders of mandatory Palestine, as early as 1937. Another two-state solution, a partition plan, was offered by the UN in 1947, as the British were preparing to relinquish the mandate for Palestine that had been given to them by the League of Nations, following the collapse of the Ottoman Empire, which had ruled those lands for hundreds of years. Arab and Muslim leaders said partition was unacceptable. They launched a war to exterminate the fledgling Jewish state that had declared independence in 1948. Israel offered two-state solutions again in 1967, 1978, 2000, 2001, 2008. Palestinian leaders declined each and every such offer. They have proposed no alternatives. Their grievance, by now it should be clear, is not the absence of a nation-state called Palestine, but rather the existence of a nation-state called Israel, the resurrected homeland of the Jewish people, a tiny island in a vast ocean of Arab and Muslim nation-states. Yet within the foreign policy establishment in the U.S. and Europe, there has, for generations, been an unshakable belief that there must be a two-state solution. President Trump has shaken that belief, changed that debate, widened what's known as the Overton Window, the range of policy proposals considered acceptable. He said that the war Hamas initiated against Israel has resulted in Gaza becoming I quote now, a demolition site. He said there's no way to remove the rubble, including unexploded bombs and IEDs, with the population in place. He said that other Arab countries, particularly Egypt, which shares a border with Gaza, and Jordan, which has a majority Palestinian population and about 3/4 of what was mandatory Palestine, should take in Gaza refugees, at least temporarily. He's not suggesting a forced evacuation. He's not saying that people who want to, he's really saying only that people who want to go should be welcomed by their neighbors. After Gaza is rebuilt, what happens? That can be figured out over the years, and it will be years it will take to clean up the rubble that have been left by Hamas's war. To discuss this and related issues, we're joined today by Jonathan Conricus, a senior fellow at FDD, who served for 24 years in the Israel Defense Forces. Also with us is Rich Goldberg, a senior advisor at FDD. Rich has served on the White House National Security Council staff and in the Senate and House. I'm Cliff May, and I'm glad you're with us, too, here on Foreign Policy. Well, good to see you guys, even remotely, virtually. Anything you want to push back on what I just said? Or you agree with me? Okay. Rich, I heard that Ambassador to the U.S. Yusuf Al-Taiba of the UAE called Trump's plan difficult but unavoidable and said, here's a quote I saw, "I don't see an alternative to what's being proposed by Trump." Do you interpret that as rather an endorsement, or is there more to it than that?
No, I watched the full clip. He's being interviewed by a CNBC Mideast interviewer at a large conference in Abu Dhabi. And he's very clear that the UAE, at least at this point, he doesn't want to take on the administration, doesn't want to take on the president directly, but he's sort of suggestive that there is a disagreement over the current proposal, but that there would be an attempt to try to find common ground with the president. Later in the interview, when he's asked sort of just big picture about Mideast policy, and it seems suggestive that it's about the Gaza proposal and specifically from the president. Does the UAE have an alternative? Are they developing an alternative plan? And he paused, it appeared, and thought for a second and said no, and said, at this point, there really is no alternative unless somebody wants to bring one forward. And so you put those two pieces together, and I don't think we should say that Ambassador Taiba was coming out with an endorsement. I don't think that's the right characterization. But I think that there is a reality check going on. And there's different parties and different stakeholders with different interests in the region. You have sponsors of the Muslim Brotherhood, allies of the Muslim Brotherhood, and I can understand why those parties will object to a future without Hamas, without the Brotherhood, either in control or in the background of Gaza to take control in the future. You have those who are, frankly, just living with fear of the Brotherhood on a daily basis. I think about Egypt. I think about Jordan. And so I understand, again, why they come out with reflexive opposition. But then you have plenty of Arab countries, including the UAE, that I would say don't fall into either category. They're not friends of the Brotherhood, quite the opposite. They don't fear the Brotherhood. And therefore, they do want to see a Gaza that is Hamas free. They do want to see a pathway to Israeli Palestinian peace because, especially for the UAE, they want to see the Abraham Accords strengthened and grow. And that, of course, leads you back to their neighbor in Saudi Arabia. Again, no friend of the Muslim Brotherhood and no fear of the Muslim Brotherhood. So I think there is a lot of opportunity, as you say, the president widening the Overton window here and having a new, fresh conversation to get outside that box of failed paradigms of so many decades.
Jonathan, as a military man, how do you see Hamas now? It was, on October 6, 2023, an army, perhaps a more sophisticated army, certainly than I understood, and maybe than a lot of Israelis understood. It's not dead. We saw when they give over the hostages, they come out with their guns, they have their uniforms, they have their, they cover their face, whatever they're doing. What is Hamas now?
Yeah, hi, Cliff, and a pleasure being on again on Foreign Policy. Last time was a long time ago. We spoke about different things. We spoke about Europe, anti-Semitism.
About your life, actually. It was a very interesting show. I recommend it to people all the time. You told some great stories.
Yeah.
My wife recommends it all the time to people.
Yeah, it was a great experience for me, first time being on. And, times are changing. We're in a different Middle East. This is about 2 years after the last time we had our podcast, and definitely a different situation. Regarding Hamas, just one thing, one reflection on what you said before that I think is really relevant when we talk about broadening the scope and the horizon of possible solutions. It dawned upon me that I think, and I'm happy to be corrected, maybe you guys know better, and maybe some of our viewers and listeners know better. I've been looking for it, but I have not found a historical evidence or proof of a conflict since the Second World War, and actually not before that either, where civilian population was blocked from fleeing a war zone. And I think it's really telling, when you think of it, the conflict between Hamas and Israel is the only war that I'm aware of where there were specific international efforts not to allow non-combatants to flee the war zone, where international organizations, indeed governments, not only didn't allow it, but actively objected to it. Egypt objected, and I think European countries, and maybe we can speak about US policies as well. And it was this very absurd situation, and it continues. That thought pattern continues, still not allowing people who want to flee out of a combat zone, a devastated area, dangerous area, an uninhabitable area in some cases, where people aren't allowing them out. I think that once you think about it, it tells you a lot about this conflict and what really is at play here. Is it really about caring for Palestinians? Is it really about humanitarian good? Or is it a political tool against the state of Israel? And as you very correctly said, Israel has offered peace 4 times. And President Trump, first term, also offered a peace plan that was flatly rejected by the Palestinians. Regarding Hamas, Hamas is the de facto ruler of Gaza. They have enough foot soldiers, small arms, ammunition, and muscle in order to remain in power. In my mind, even though significant damage has been inflicted upon Hamas's military capabilities, their long-range rockets, their command and control, most of their infrastructure, most of their stockpiles of other weapons have been taken out, but they are still in power. And long story short, they will remain in power as long as Israel keeps allowing in humanitarian aid that doesn't go directly to the people, but is channeled through Hamas's hands and the organizations that help Hamas, like UNRWA, and that is the currency that Hamas has in order to stay in power and exercise leverage over the population. That and brute force. We've seen lots of videos coming out of Gaza with Hamas thugs shooting Palestinians in their legs and feet for disobeying, trying to get food, or for criticizing Hamas, quite prominent these days. And we see that Hamas is busy reestablishing its control. So Hamas is the force to reckon with in Gaza. 15, almost 16 months of fighting have not really defeated Hamas, and Israel has not yet achieved its number 1, 2, or 3 goals. It hasn't defeated Hamas militarily. It has not yet disassembled Hamas's control over the population, and Israel has not yet returned its hostages. Hopefully, Israel has plans to do that and change the equation.
Yeah, and I would say part of the reason for that is that the so-called international community, they have intervened in a way that's detrimental to Israel and detrimental to those Palestinian Gazans who are not part of Hamas. It's, for one thing, there was a meme for years that Gaza was an open-air prison, and it wasn't. Hamas fighters went out to train. Rich people could go out through Egypt. Thousands of Gazan workers came into Israel every day to take jobs. It's simply, but they're trying to make it into a prison now by saying we're not allowing Gazans to leave. We don't think they should be allowed to leave. Now, why that's the case, I think there are 2 reasons. One, Rich touched on. I think they may be afraid in Jordan or Egypt that if Hamas members get in, they'll be destabilizing, they'll be terrorists, they'll be Muslim Brotherhood. But I think part of the reason also was they were happy to see Gazans serve as human shields for Hamas during this war effort. And never before during a war effort that I know was there a demand that you must supply food and fuel to your enemy, and everybody knew that's what was happening during the fighting. You have to do that. And by the way, you need to come up with a plan for the day after you defeat them, because we're so sure you can defeat them. Again, Roosevelt and Churchill were not thinking during World War II, we got to supply the Germans with some food and some fuel, and we got to figure out a Marshall Plan before they surrender. No, after the surrender, that's when that comes. Go ahead, Rich.
Well, Cliff, I'll put a third big reason why there is such opposition to this, and I think this might be the number one reason of all. And that is, when you look at the UN Relief and Works Agency, we've talked a lot about it. The president just signed an executive order to cut off any future funding for UNRWA after the congressional ban expires coming up next month. This is the so-called refugee agency for Palestinian refugees from the 1948-1949 Israeli War of Independence, and then some others from 1967 as well. But in general, this is a population that was in the few 100,000, matching the number of Jewish refugees kicked out of Arab countries back in 1948-1949. And all of those Jewish refugees were absorbed either by the state of Israel or other Western countries. The Palestinian refugees, the Arab refugees of the war, were put into camps and told by Arab countries, you will be refugees because you're not allowed to be absorbed into the Arab world. We're going to come back. We're going to destroy this nascent state. So don't worry, you're going to go back to your homes. And this generation after generation passing on this idea, this identity, that your existence is just to grow up to be ready to defeat the Jews and push them into the Mediterranean Sea. Institutionalized into a UN agency that now counts 5-6 million people as refugees. In Gaza, I come back to close the loop here, UNRWA, of the 2.1 million people, civilians living in Gaza before the war, classified something like 1.8 million of them as refugees. So everybody who's in Gaza almost is considered one of these Palestinian refugees.
Even though they're in Palestine.
From where?
Even though they're in Palestinian territory, by the way. Where else can you be a refugee on what you claim to be your homeland?
Of course, these people were born there. They lived there. It was Egyptian control before it was Israeli control. I mean, it's an absurd notion on its face. It's an absurd notion. Let's concede that. And yet, that's part of the mythology. That's part of the political war on Israel. That's the political arm of the military arm you saw on October 7th. It goes hand in glove together. And so if you were to say, oh, you can be a refugee from Gaza, you can leave Gaza and become an actual refugee from a war, which would be a legitimate way of becoming a refugee, you would lose the fabric of this mythology and the war on Israel because they'd no longer be refugees from Israel. And I think they want to keep them trapped there to maintain UNRWA, to maintain the refugee status, to maintain the war on Israel, because the minute a person leaves Gaza for a better life as a refugee from this war, they're no longer on track to reclaim their home in modern day Israel and push the Jews into the sea. And actually what happens, the war of 75 plus years finally comes to an end. They don't want that to happen.
And you know what I find particularly disturbing here is the Secretary General of the UN, currently Antonio Guterres. He should be looking at this situation and saying, boy, I didn't create this situation, but it's a terrible situation. We shouldn't have a UN agency that is in essence committed to the destruction of a UN member. I'm going to do something about it. And it's just the opposite. He's committed to UNRWA. He's committed to its mission. I would say to say he's committed to the destruction of Israel, he certainly is not disturbed. He's indifferent to that outcome, it seems to me. And that really raises big questions on what the U.S. relationship should be to the United Nations, not just the UN Human Rights Council and the UN Commissioner of Human Rights and all the other agencies and peacekeeping that we spend huge amounts of money on, in the tens of billions every year, 20 billion, 29 billion, I forget, you probably remember, Rich, every year. This should be one of the things maybe that DOGE looks at is maybe we cut back severely on what we're spending over there. Go ahead, Jonathan.
I think, Cliff, if I can add one thing on the UN, which I think is really important on the macro level. I served at UN headquarters on behalf of the State of Israel, on behalf of the IDF. I was the first Israeli officer to be seconded there. Served 3 very interesting years, gave me lots of insight into what I would call the belly of the beast. And I totally agree with what Rich said and what you said. What I think we should focus on, as the name of our organization, the Foundation for Defense of Democracies, in the UN, democracies are a minority, and in the UN, democracies do not call the shots, and the UN has become a tool for non-democratic countries to bully their way around the world, to get funds, to get programs, to find cushy jobs for former members of their regime, and to do all kinds of things and pursue their undemocratic goals. When you look at it, it's almost 75% of the member states are not democracies. You have 2 non-democracies, 2 tyrannic regimes that have veto power in the Security Council, and you have an automatic, overwhelming majority of non-democracies in the General Assembly. That in itself, I think, is absurd. And I think that, there should be some kind, in my mind, there should be tremendous, a gut renovation of the UN, complete overhaul of all of its institutions, its mechanisms, its different fora. It's a massive bureaucracy. I mean, if we talk about USAID and we think that that's a big organization with lots of money, and reportedly investigations are ongoing and we discover new things every day of where American taxpayer money went to for what reportedly obscene goals. The UN is far, far, far bigger, more diverse, and in my mind, more corrupt. And there's real room needed for either drastic reform or more than that. And I think it's a dangerous point when the only global government that we have in this world is beholden to non-democratic countries.
Yeah, I want to get Rich's view, even with this bit of digression. It's interesting. One thing I want to say is I don't want the UN ever to be seen as global government. I don't want in my lifetime for there to be anything approaching global government. Not global. I'm against the global courts, the ICJ, the ICC, International Criminal Court, and they're all corrupt in various ways. I think the idea of global government, this was a utopian idea way back when. It's nice in science fiction shows, but we're nowhere near where we should even be contemplating that. And again, we're digressing, but I know, Rich, you've thought a lot about international organizations in the UN. You run programs here on that at FDD. Maybe just give a couple of your reflections on how bad it is and what you see as a feasible road ahead.
Yeah, I don't want to rehash. I mean, Jonathan, I think, gave a great summary of just how perverted the UN has become. And I'll add one more perverted element on there, and that is the democracies that are outnumbered and are being taken advantage of are largely the funders of the circus, which makes zero sense. But here's where I do have a note of caution, and that is our European allies, our Western European allies, our traditional allies, even some in Asia, like Japan,
Australia,
they write very big checks. And sometimes I'm not so sure they don't believe in what the UN is doing, because a great example would be the ICC, as you say. Here's an example of an international organization that's supposed to be, created for all the right reasons, to go after war crimes in the third world and places that don't have functioning judiciaries and rule of law, and hold bad people accountable. We, the United States, didn't want to participate in it. We thought this was a danger long term, which obviously has become. Israel didn't want to participate in it. They saw the danger for them as well. But our European allies, Japan, Germany, the UK, Canada, Italy, I've just named the top 5 or 6 funders of the ICC, all of whom, by the way, live and breathe under the blanket of security and protection and deterrence that the United States military provides. They are the primary funders of the ICC and are standing by it in investigations and prosecutions of Israelis and investigations ongoing of Americans. Both of our countries are not members of the ICC, zero jurisdiction here, and yet our closest allies are funding the whole thing. So the UN is broken in many, many, many ways. Unfortunately, our partners and allies go along with it and participate in it for various reasons, whether it's ideological or just tradition. They like their cocktail parties. And I think we need to be clear-eyed about it. It's not going to go away. To the extent that we have a veto power at the UN Security Council, we better wield it. We need to speak up. It's sort of a do no harm situation of don't let the UN do harm. And when you see the UN doing harm, defund it, degrade it, get rid of it if you can. And I think UNRWA is a great example of that. It's a clear path for us to defund, put pressure on partners and allies for them to defund, and then strip its immunity. It's no longer part of the UN. Long ago, it became a pseudo-independent agency. We should de-recognize that it has any immunity under the Immunities Treaty, and we should put sanctions on it, let people sue it for terror victim status, all the things. Really just destroy this organization. And then our allies will be left saying, okay, well, what do we do now? I guess we'll fund something else. Good. Fund something else. Better. So we just have to stick up for ourselves. The UN's not going anywhere. We can absolutely save $1 billion and not give the regular budget allocation to the UN, which just goes to all crazy things like lowering the flag for President Raisi of Iran when he dies, or various anti-Israeli organizations inside the Secretariat. But long term, we have to get our allies on board, because this idea that if just the democracies would stick together, something would change. We got some problems in some of the democracies too.
All right, we're recording this on Thursday. Full disclosure, we're going to be releasing it on Friday. People will be listening over the weekend, so you're going to be cautious with this answer because they'll know if you predict wrong. But we had President Trump saying, "Look, I'm really sick of this. All the hostages should be released by this Saturday. I want them all released, or hell will pay," or whatever it was. Now, I assume if hell is to pay, it's Benjamin Netanyahu will need to reach into his wallet to come up with the bills to pay. What he has said is, look, if you release, I think, 9 hostages, I'll keep the ceasefire. Hamas, as we record this, I think has said, well, okay, we had said we won't release any hostages, but maybe we'll release 3 hostages. Jonathan, have I described it what you think is the reality? And do you want to dare make a prediction and be wrong over the weekend?
Yeah, predictions are dangerous, especially in the Middle East, and definitely when you're talking about a day's difference. What I'm struggling to make sense of events, because in plain language, basically Israel got a blank check from the US president. And let's say we're at Costco and we get a blank check. Instead of buying the entire store and going home very happy, we went to the hot dog stand, bought a hot dog, and got out of the store. doesn't make a lot of sense what Israel just reportedly has said and done, but that is what it looks as if Israel is doing. Now, what I think, in a more without any allegories, what I think really is happening is that the most important working assumption in Israel, in the defense establishment, and most probably in the political echelon as well, is that we have a small and narrowing window of opportunity to get our hostages back. We're nearing the 500-day milestone, a horrible, tremendously humiliating milestone for the state of Israel to come to. We have 76 hostages in Hamas captivity. 36 of them, according to Israel, officially have been pronounced dead, and their bodies are held in Hamas captivity. And there are serious doubts and worries about the status and the condition of the others. And I think we understand that this may be the only way to get hostages home. And as such, what we see Israel doing is, despite the fact that the president gave very wide boundaries for activity, very wide boundaries for activity, Israel is taking a much smaller action and actually telling Hamas, it's fine if you just give us the bare minimum of 3 hostages that we agreed upon according to the first stages of the negotiations. It looks as if, and here is the cautious part, it looks as if 3 hostages will be returned. I'm getting signals in Israel that maybe next week there will be an additional 9 and not just 3. As that is happening, Israel continues to abide by the agreement. More than 600 trucks of humanitarian goods is coming into Gaza every day, into the hands of Hamas. Palestinians have been allowed to move freely from the southern part to the north, and they are now all over the Gaza Strip. And the only presence of Israeli troops is along the Rafah corridor, which I think is important to mention. According to the first agreement, Israel is supposed to vacate at the end of the 42nd day of the first phase. And as things are going now, we're on track to doing that. And that will be a major moment.
Rich, do you have any sense about what's going on in Gaza where the Israelis are not? I've seen some reports that Gazans have come from the south, gone to the north, realize, oh, this is much worse than I thought. There is nothing to come back to. And they've turned around and gone back to the south, where at least they get some of the aid that has not been stolen by Hamas, or is not, maybe is being sold by Hamas to get funds. But they're finding that there's not much in the north. There's no good reason to stay in the north. Have you been seeing those reports?
Well, that's exactly what Steve Witkoff, the president's Middle East envoy, said when he went and toured Gaza himself with his own eyes. And granted, he was not, I think, out there first with the statements from the president. He said he had not coordinated the president's statements on Gaza and people needing to leave, but that once he went there and saw with his own eyes, and he saw exactly that, of people coming north and saying, what do we have here to be here for? Like, why can't we go somewhere where we can have a safe living environment? He said the president's absolutely right. We should have some sort of arrangement where people can leave Gaza for now while it's being rebuilt, which will take a decade or 15 years, according to Witkoff, who's a professional real estate developer. So we also are seeing videos emerging. You can find these on social media. I hope they get more attention, of people being interviewed in the streets. There are some brave Palestinians who, during the course of the war, there are certain organizations, Middle East Voices for Peace, that have tried to find people who will speak out and talk about what's going on in their lives. What are they seeing? How is Hamas treating them? And they have these interviews of people saying, get me out of here. Let me out. I want to leave. Why are they trapping me here? And when you have voices from inside Gaza saying, let me leave, and you're a state actor denying them the right to leave, I think you have some international legal problems on your side if you're the actor trying to deny them the right to leave a conflict zone. So absolutely, that is true. I want to add a little bit on Jonathan's reaction to what's happened this week from an American perspective. I think the president changed the entire rules of the game and the paradigm under which we've been operating. He did so already on his Gaza proposal. He's done so again within the terms of negotiating what comes next inside the ceasefire. Israel has been operating for 16 months as the bad cop to America's good cop. When Biden would pressure Israel whenever Hamas would pull back and very publicly say Israel has to do more, has to give more, it was always inflicted wounds on Israel by doing that because they were the weakened party at the table. The international community sensed weakness. They'd have to come after Israel. And Hamas says, great, we're going to get more out of this. We'll keep holding out for more. You've completely flipped that narrative. You now have the president of the United States being more hawkish than the prime minister of Israel on these issues. He's the one who is playing the bad cop to Bibi's good cop this week, which is an amazing thing to think about. He's also already gone farther than Bibi on the idea of Gaza and reframing the end state objectives in a breathtaking way. So Israel is now, I think, operating with much more flexibility and maneuverability because of the way the president is approaching this, of saying, you think you Hamas, you're going to be the tough guy this week. You're going to say you're just going to break the deal because you have the leverage of the hostages. And by the way, so many events converging that led to the Hamas threat. You have the Israelis completing one of their biggest concessions of phase one and the withdrawal of Netzarim right before this. The Hamas leadership goes to Tehran and coordinates with their masters about what the next move should be. And of course, you have the reaction to 3 hostages coming out last weekend looking like Holocaust survivors. And we all sit here being like, whoa, if that's not going to motivate people to go back to war, I don't know what will. That's not Hamas. That's not how Hamas sees it. They see the reaction of the hostage families crying and begging Netanyahu, we're running out of time. They look like Holocaust survivors. My loved one's going to die unless you concede more to Hamas right now. So they go all in. It's perverted, but it's what is happening. And so you have this dynamic where the president says, oh, you want to play tough guy? You think you have the leverage? Let me show you what's going to happen. The gates of hell are going to open. I'm going to back Israel to the hilt in going after you. You don't even know what's going to come next. Maybe humanitarian flows and aid, maybe sanctions on sponsors and enablers and all kinds of things that could come from the United States that nobody knows. And the president's being intentionally vague for good reason, because it's better for you not to know what could come next, but to imagine it. Bibi then endorses the Trump plan and then has the maneuverability to say, okay, is it going to be all hostages? Going to be 9 hostages? Maybe there's a deal going behind the scenes now to get 9 hostages, as Jonathan's saying, after 3 hostages. By the way, the IDF might want more than like 4 days' notice to restart a major war. And so maybe they need a little bit more time if you actually are going to have the ceasefire collapse at some point here, because let's be honest, if Hamas did it this week, they're going to do it next week. They're going to do it the following week. And it's going to get harder and harder and harder as you get towards the hardest parts of phase 1 of the negotiation of phase 2. So this is a helpful dynamic. And I think in the end, if come Saturday, the prime minister of Israel was supposed to look at hostage families in the face and say, I had an opportunity to get 3 out and I said no because I wanted 9 or I wanted all, they're going to say you killed my loved ones. So he can't do that. If Hamas has backed down under the president's threat and said, okay, we won't be tough guy this week, maybe next week, we'll just go along with the plan, we'll give you 3, I think the prime minister has to take 3.
I want to just pick up a thing you said, and maybe Jonathan knows. So the Hamas leaders in Tehran, those are Hamas leaders not from Gaza, I assume, but coming out of Doha in Qatar. Is that correct? Okay, and we assume so, but we may assume that they're still taking instructions from Tehran, from the mullahs in Tehran. Now, and again, I've argued this before. I think you guys have too. I know you have, Rich. That they're coming back to when they get back to Qatar with their orders from Tehran. The Qataris ought to say, you have to understand, we are a major non-NATO ally of the U.S. So what are the orders that Tehran's giving you? We need to know. And here's what we want you to do. We want you to tell Hamas, Mohammed Deif, or whoever it is in Gaza, let the hostages go. Trump is really serious about this, and you have to do this. You have to say publicly that that's what they're to do, or you're going to leave your hotel room in handcuffs. That would seem to me to be a good course of action right now. Go ahead, Rich. I know you. I don't want Jonathan
I'll defer to
weighing in.
Jonathan.
I don't want
they'd be
Jonathan to
having
weigh in on American policy. I want him to talk only about Israeli policy.
They'll be having a seance to reach Dave, I think, if they want to negotiate with him.
I don't mean no. I mean Mohammed Sinwar. That's what I was thinking of. I'm sorry.
Yeah, no, but
the brother
but
of
for sure,
yes,
Sinwar. Listen, I think the Qataris are in an interesting position right now. They obviously have a good working relationship with the White House at the moment. But if you expose yourself as a bad actor at this critical juncture, that can change very quickly.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that they don't want to lose the favor of the White House at this point. But to your point, yes, Iran is the master. That's the parent company ultimately of the subsidiary. We know that they've been coordinating since before October 7th, the training, the logistics, the funding, etc. The week after October 7th, I'll never forget this. The summit that was held in Doha, just like a mile away from where Tony Blinken, the Secretary of State, was flying in to talk to the Qataris, the Iranians and Hamas were holding a summit of what should we do next, 1 week after October 7th. So they've never stopped coordinating this. And so it absolutely makes sense in the context of all the other pieces that Iran's thinking about as they're vulnerable right now, as the Trump administration has declared maximum pressure is back, but also said they're willing to do a deal. No strategic air defense for Iran. I do think that there is an Iranian piece to this, even though there's obviously heavy Hamas itself and its strategic aims.
You know, Jonathan, King Abdullah, your neighbor, was at the White House. Trump was telling him, here's what I want you to do. And he was being, well, we'll take children who need medical attention, but I don't know about Gaza refugees. Well, the Egyptians they're starting to work on a plan on this. Seems to me, one might say, it's kind of late in the game for Egypt and Jordan to be thinking, what kind of plan would we like to see for Gaza, which after all borders Egypt, which after all is a territory on Palestinian soil, as is Jordan, I might add, eastern Palestine. Somehow it seems to me both should have been in contact with the Israelis from the beginning, saying, you're going to fight a war against Hamas. Let us tell you what we want to see the day after, because both should be able to say we don't want to see Hamas in power any more than you do, and let's talk it through. But they didn't. They kept silent and thought it's Israel's problem. It's the problem of the Gazans who are there. It's not our problem. Our problem is to get aid and security assistance from the Americans. We have other fish to fry.
Yeah, I think you touched upon the reason. Just a while back, you spoke about the American pressure on Israel, the diplomatic pressure that also allowed Egypt and Jordan to understand that the pressure is on Israel. It is not on them. It is not on Hamas. It is not on Hezbollah or the Iranians. It is on Israel. Even though Israel is attacked by these various Iranian proxies, for some odd reason, the American administration applied pressure on Israel to find solutions and, first and foremost, really denied Israel the ability to really defeat the enemy. Defeating the enemy means going for its center of gravity, hitting that center of gravity until the enemy says, I cannot take it anymore, I give up, I surrender. And Israel was prevented from doing that. Now, of course, Jordan looks at the situation, for the last 15, 16 months, and they don't feel a lot of pressure to do anything creative. And to be honest, I think that the problem lies much more with Egypt than with Jordan. Jordan doesn't share a border with the Gaza Strip. It doesn't share historical ties with Gaza. The connections between Jordan is more to Judea and Samaria. Jordanians once occupied that area before and during when the state of Israel was founded,
and expelled the Jews, Israel,
expelled Jews, and of course did a lot of negative things. But their historical connection is to Judea and Samaria, not to Gaza. I think Gaza is Egyptian heritage. I think that Gaza is the result of extremely cynical and cruel Egyptian policies. And I think Gaza is a mess that the U.S. should demand that Egypt help solve and alleviate, and not so much Jordan. I think it's telling that General Sisi, as the president calls him, has refused or delayed, or I don't know exact wording, but is not coming to Washington, reportedly because he doesn't have a plan. He doesn't have a counteroffer to what President Trump has said he wants to happen. And Egypt is pivotal here. Now, I think we should zoom out and speak about Egypt a little bit more on the bigger scale, because that is an actor. We talk about, Qatar. Are they acting in good faith? Are they a positive force? In my book, 100% no. They are nefarious, backstabbing, and two-faced or three-faced in the sense that they support terror. They incite to violence through their vast influence network. Al Jazeera does the bidding of most jihadi organizations around the world, and they support terrorism in almost everything that they do. Yet, sadly, they have a seat at the table, and sadly, I think their stock has gone up with this current American administration, and I think that's very, very regrettable. And I think that no pressure has been applied on Qatar to do what you said in the beginning. Of course, I smiled at it because it'll never happen, because Qatar isn't incentivized to do anything of the like, not to apply pressure on Hamas, not to do anything in that kind, because nobody's applying pressure on Qatar. Nobody's freezing Qatari bank accounts. Nobody's taking sanctions against Qatari financial institutions. Nobody's talking about relocating the American airbase there, and nobody's talking about anything that would cause the Qataris any discomfort. But if we go back to Egypt, where the real, ground zero of the problem called Gaza is, Egypt, in my mind, should bear responsibility for its deliberate strategy to use and abuse the Gaza Strip as a vehicle for their own foreign policy. On one hand, Egypt knowingly allowed and profited from the transfer of weapons through Sinai into Gaza, into the hands of Hamas and Islamic Jihad. And on the other hand, once every few years, when there was fighting between Hamas and Israel, Egypt came to the rescue and negotiated ceasefires and collected tremendous diplomatic currency for doing so. Yet Egypt has offered absolutely no solution to the situation. Egypt, I think, should probably made a world record in the fastest construction of a border wall after the war started. They made sure that no Palestinians were allowed to escape hell in Gaza by going into Egypt, and they built that wall along the Egyptian-Gazan border, and they have made very sure that nobody crosses it, except for a few people who were rich enough to spend more than $5,000 per person to get a special permit into Egypt. The cynicism is, I think, off the charts, and what saddens me is that, again, no pressure is applied on Egypt. There's no consequence for being a bad actor, and there are no consequences for not helping U.S. foreign policy, of actually undermining U.S. foreign policy, undermining regional stability, and being cruel to Palestinians and preventing civilians from fleeing a combat zone. There are so many bad things that Egypt has been doing that in a normal, playbook of international behavior should be punishable. But it isn't. And I think it is high time for a policy change on behalf of Israel against Egypt. For many years, we have been tiptoeing around Egyptian security needs while they have been pursuing their own needs and totally disregarding ours. Gaza is the case in hand. And I would also recommend lots of other American, etc., pressure on Egypt. And there are many places to push.
Let me ask. I don't want you talking about American pressure on Israel. I want Rich to talk about American pressure. Should America's policy vis-a-vis Egypt be much tougher, Rich?
Well, absolutely, and I think that that's already a direction that they're going. I mean, the King of Jordan, who, for those who have sat in meetings with him, have dealt with Jordan, is quite charming. Very thoughtful, intellectual.
Genuine moderate.
While he is tip of the spear of sponsoring BDS around the world and throwing some of the most virulent anti-Semitic rhetoric, certainly since October 7th, but even before then, put that aside, still a very important strategic partner of the United States and Israel, quite frankly. The irony of all of it, of course, is that he spits in the Israelis' face on a daily basis as he depends entirely on Israel for his survival and accepts that assistance on a daily basis. But this is the Middle East that we have. The Egyptians not as charming as King Abdullah, not making the trip to Washington for all the reasons that Jonathan laid out, and therefore not really in good graces at the moment, I think you could assume. If they are rejecting this very publicly, scrambling to find an alternative, not coming to Washington to explain their case, not able to really be a thoughtful partner for President Trump, they are then potentially increasing their chances of some sort of punitive measures on them. Now, do we have an interest in not seeing Egypt fall? I believe so. I don't think you want to see the Muslim Brotherhood take over Egypt as we saw during the Arab Spring. I don't think that's what Israel's interest is either. I think that the lack of shipping through the Red Sea into the Suez Canal over the last year plus because of the Houthis has strained a great deal the Egyptian economy in certain ways, and they are a little bit more vulnerable than they have been in the past. And so we should think about that and balance that as we take a course of action. At the same time, though, there's no reason we can't take a harder line on specific concessions that we want to see from the Egyptians. One might say they're actually more vulnerable and therefore more dependent on us than ever before. And therefore we have more ability to get our way with the Egyptians at this moment. And certainly if the Saudis behind the scenes would join us in these demands, that's a lot of influence that we would have over Cairo together. So whether it is the idea of building the underground wall to ensure there's no smuggling in the future through Rafah, or in this case, understanding what's going to happen with the future of the population of Gaza and the future of Gaza, absolutely Egypt should be in the hot seat. Let's also remember the easiest solution of all is obviously just to open the Sinai Desert and let the desert bloom for the people of Gaza, and Gaza is cleared out very quickly. The Egyptians are not standing for that. Do we have to really say it's the most obvious solution of all? The land is there. It's very close by. It's vacant. It's available. It's pretty close to where they are today. So if that's not going to be the solution offered, then I do wonder what the Egyptian solution would be, because I've heard a rumor, and you see these leaked reports that they've submitted a counter proposal of we're going to rebuild Gaza with everybody in it in 5 years. Please. You're not going to rebuild Gaza in 5 years. You're not going to do it with everybody in it. You're certainly just going to hand Gaza back to Hamas with that plan. That's crazy.
Last question for today. Quick, but I just quickly want to get in. Lebanon, my understanding is that the ceasefire is in effect, but the Lebanese armed forces, they're not taking control of the southern part of the country as they're supposed to. And Israel has decided it's going to maintain some key defensive positions in the south beyond what's supposed to be the withdrawal date. Jonathan, very quickly, if that's true, then Rich, say how the U.S. administration is likely to respond to Israel staying in the south. Go ahead, Jonathan, quickly.
Yeah, that is what I understand. That's what I hear from the IDF, and that's what I've seen on the ground in terms of ground activity by the IDF. We're talking about the eastern sector of the border, the area surrounding Kiryat Shmona and Metula, Kafar Kile, Marjayoun, El Khiyam on the Lebanese side. Those are the more problematic areas. To be frank, the Lebanese armed forces have deployed into other areas, but they have still not completed the deployment to all of southern Lebanon as per the agreement. And Israel cannot withdraw from that area with a peaceful mind, knowing that it is not in the hands of Hezbollah. And Israel has said that as long as that is the case, we will have to remain in key tactical positions in order to ensure the safety of Israeli civilians. To remind everybody watching, I know there are so many data points flying around about the war, but between 50 and 60,000 Israelis were evacuated from the border on October 8, 9, and 10, and they still have not been able to return safely to their homes. As we speak, as the ceasefire has been more than 2 months in effect in Lebanon, that is the ultimate aim of the sovereign state of Israel in this context, is to allow its civilians to go back to their homes. We have not yet reached that stage, and that is the prism through which Israel is operating. Israel has been working behind the scenes, I think, quite well to get approval for things before declaring them and before doing them. It appears as if there will be more Lebanese objection to this now, and we perhaps will be coming to kind of a more significant friction point. It'll be interesting to see what the parties, the US and France, will do, and if it will allow Israel this. It's definitely needed, but the challenge will be if the US will actually allow it, and if the French will allow it, and how hard they will explain to the Lebanese that this is necessity, since the Lebanese armed forces haven't deployed in the south fully.
And Rich, final point is how the U.S., I don't care how the French respond, but how does the U.S. respond?
Well, I think Jonathan laid this out pretty well. I mean, the U.S. side would like to see continued political change in a positive direction from Beirut. So they have a new president, they have a new prime minister, they're building a new government. It is, at least ostensibly, not of Hezbollah and not pro-Hezbollah. That is not, however, to say it is anti-Hezbollah. And that's the part that I think we got to be really clear-eyed about going forward. If there are certain key metrics that they can get delivered by the Lebanese that does not really put Israel at a disadvantage, and the Israelis are willing to go forward and withdraw their forces if they see real concrete movement, the LAF moving into southern Lebanon, some substantial reassurances, and then actually testing those reassurances of continued strikes throughout southern Lebanon against Hezbollah, against Iranian smuggling that we see already restarting. And you see the Israelis taking activity against that, and the Americans are not objecting to that. In fact, there appears to be quite substantial support for the Israelis doing what they need to do for any ceasefire violations by Hezbollah. But I think we are at this major potential friction point of, are the Lebanese willing to do enough to give the Israelis reassurance, to give the Americans reassurance that the Israelis should go forward? What is enough of the multiple points that are on the table that they're supposed to move forward on? I'm very worried about it long term. Even if you became, comfortable with sort of a status quo, where you are in the ceasefire is just where it is. These are the lines, and nobody's going to try to activate a hot war, but Iran's going to try to resupply Hezbollah. Hezbollah's going to move around, see if they can get away with it over time. The Israelis will take strikes. And this is sort of how things evolve. Over time, I think that works to Hezbollah's advantage. And so I don't think you can sustain that status quo for long. But you do need to see if you can't put more pressure, use our influence and leverage on this new Lebanese government. We always wanted to see an election of a non-Hezbollah-aligned president. It happened. We always wanted to see a new government that was not controlled or influenced by Hezbollah. It may be the case. We should allow that possibility to play out. If we are proven wrong, as many a cynic and skeptic believe that will not happen, then, in my view, the future writes itself as far as what is in the best interest for the U.S. and Israel.
All right. Thanks very much, Rich Goldberg. Thanks very much, Jonathan Conricus. Thanks to all of you who have been with us for this conversation here today on Foreign Policy.